Good morning, Management Committee and fellow employees. I'd like to begin by thanking you for giving your time to hear my proposal of what I believe our organisation's vision statement should entail. I have created this presentation to help highlight what I believe is the best framework for practice for working specifically in the Indigenous child welfare sector. As a practitioner in the field, I'm aware of some of the opportunities and considerations for development when working with Indigenous children and families. It is evident that there is a need to overcome the lack of support for Indigenous human rights and social justice issues caused by previous policies and welfare mistakes. I believe that with the guidance from Indigenous communities and families, a best practice framework can be developed. In doing this, we're ensuring that as an organisation, we're providing support that is relevant to Indigenous human rights and social justice issues. In order to understand and best respond to the current issues faced by Indigenous people, we as practitioners must first be familiar with the historical experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The causes of child abuse and neglect are complex, involving both individual and social factors. Understanding child maltreatment in Indigenous communities requires a broad perspective that takes into account both historical and current conditions. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, Indigenous people were discriminated against, segregated, and assimilated into a European culture against their will. Countless children were removed from their families to work for and be raised by white people. Unfortunately, during this time, they endured abuse and neglect. It was the government policies at the time that resulted in these harmful actions that were based on westernised values and did not accept Indigenous culture. From these racially prejudiced policies, many Indigenous people have been left with compounding trauma and other issues linked to traumatic experiences from the forced colonisation. I believe that as social welfare workers, we can learn important lessons from this history. Firstly, considering the concepts of family, culture, and community to Indigenous people. Secondly, having reflective welfare practice that includes critical analysis of past and present policies. And finally, understanding the consequences and impacts that these past policies have on the reoccurrence of current welfare and social justice issues. If we begin understanding these concepts, I believe that our organisation is capable of providing the best practice available for Indigenous children and their families. In our field of work, there are many competing demands, one of which is the ongoing task of developing a professional knowledge and expertise. Without a clear practice framework, we cannot respond to issues without establishing a clear focus and direction for our assessment and intervention. No matter how experienced we are, to be effective in our roles, we need to continue to reflect on and build our professional knowledge and practice skills in order to deliver clear, knowledge-guided practice. One of the core concepts that I believe needs to be central to our practice framework is culturally responsive practice. Culturally responsive practice values cultural differences, seeks to become culturally informed, and demonstrates this in action. This includes addressing potential barriers to relationship building and engagement. Culturally responsive practice seeks to ensure the safety and well-being of children while recognising cultural diversity. Another reason our vision statement needs to incorporate culturally respectful practice is due to the immeasurable impacts that government policies had on the rights and justice of Indigenous people. Again, understanding and being aware of these impacts will potentially aid in providing the best practice possible. Some impacts from past policies and practice that I believe are essential to be aware of include the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in statutory care, out-of-home care standards, prevention and intervention methods, and the way family welfare professionals assist families. By considering these topics, our social welfare workers will be provided with a framework for practice that incorporates the social justice and human rights of Indigenous people. To continue on from that, I'll begin by explaining each topic and how it impacts on the way we practice when working with Indigenous children and their families. This will clearly highlight to you the considerations that have been made in forming what I believe to be the most appropriate vision statement for our organisation. The overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the welfare system is important to explore. In Australia, Indigenous children are almost 8 times more likely to be the victim of abuse or neglect, over 9 times more likely to be on a care and protection order, and 10 times more likely to be in out-of-home care. What makes these statistics so important to consider is the concerning fact that over the previous 5 years, these numbers have increased. Research highlights that the underlying cause of this overrepresentation is the intergenerational effects of previous separations from family and culture. From this, we need to consider the placement of Indigenous children in out-of-home care. Unfortunately, the lack of culturally suitable carers means children are being placed into families who don't identify with the child's own cultural background. As a result from this, Indigenous children are not being appropriately supported. This then creates feelings of isolation and increases the likelihood of the child facing deep-seated displacement from cultural identity. Finally, I think it is essential to consider the way we intervene and attempt to prevent the increasing numbers of Indigenous children in the system. Despite attempts to improve outcomes for Indigenous children who are engaged in child welfare services, there are still major issues. Reports show that there is a lack of focus on prevention of harm, placing too much emphasis on identification and response to harm through investigation and out-of-home care. I believe that more care needs to be placed on the causes of maltreatment rather than resolving the issues once it has already occurred. As child and family welfare workers, we need to put more focus on preventative practice. From this, we can begin to make changes to individual, caregiver, and community risk factors. It is a difficult task for child protection and family support workers to be effective in working with Indigenous children and families in a policy context that ignores the broader issues discussed. As workers, we can become overwhelmed by the size and complexity of the problems faced. I believe a vision for best practice needs to address the social justice and human rights issues I have presented to you. Best practice in Indigenous welfare cannot occur without acknowledgement and understanding of historical context. Historical policies have inflicted major human rights violations with no regard for social justice. Thus, it is essential when working with Indigenous children and families to apply culturally appropriate practice reflecting a human rights and social justice perspective. Alongside this, I believe we must also consider the benefits of multi-professional collaboration. As child protection practitioners, it is important for us to play a role in enabling effective collaboration with Indigenous agencies and communities. This means recognising the value of other perspectives, having a willingness to learn from the practice knowledge of others, respecting professional differences, and taking time to plan together. Effective collaboration with Indigenous agencies and communities is critical for identifying culturally appropriate interventions. If we can incorporate multi-professional collaboration into our vision, I believe our organisation will better achieve positive outcomes for Indigenous children. Another important concept to consider that is essential to our vision statement is social justice. Social justice is about making sure that every Australian, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, has choices about how they live and the means to make those choices. Social justice is grounded in the practical, day-to-day realities of life. It's about waking up in a house with running water and proper sanitation, offering children an education that helps them develop their potential and respect their culture. Social justice also means recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the original peoples of this land. I believe it is important for our organisation's practice framework to focus on outcomes, build authentic relationships characterised by a genuine desire to help, broadly assess risk, harm and needs, exercise power thoughtfully, value cultural differences and collaborate with others. In all areas of our practice, we need to be critically reflecting and demonstrating critical action. And finally, my vision statement for our organisation is to work from a social justice perspective where we advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples, promote an Indigenous perspective on different issues, build support and understanding for an Indigenous perspective, and to empower Indigenous peoples. In doing this, we'll be assisting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to live a life of opportunity and dignity, free from discrimination and disadvantage. Again, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to the considerations I've made to achieving culturally accommodating practice for Indigenous Australians in child protection.